Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're not in a food coma from lunch. I'm not here to tell you how to do tech. I used to be a nerd. I used to be a tech and a coder. When I was 14, I got my hands on a book by Tab Books called Build Your Own Self-Programming Robot, and ordered shed loads of ICs and literally built something that looked like R2-D2 in a trash bin because I was a Star Wars nerd. And that led to a career, ironically, in AI. So I wound up working for the Department of Defense when I was 15, learning Prolog, writing expert systems for decisioning, moving into doing ADA for real-time embedded systems, where we used to code our own EPROMs. So we would literally write the code, burn it into an EPROM, stick it in the logic board, and see what happened. These days it's kind of different. I sit on the business, so I try to guide and drive things. I've spent the last 20 years in financial services, generally speaking, making rich people richer. So I left a couple of years ago because I decided that was not what I wanted to do anymore. And now I do advisory work. So I sit on the financial advisory board for Open UK, trying to help figure out how to push open source data and AI into financial services, but also being that bridge back to all the people in the open source community. What do the bankers need? What are they looking for? What's important to them? You mentioned when you were introducing me about the debt, right? So one of the many hats I wear is I do senior advisory work for a lot of companies. I get called in to explain why boards are not able to do their digital transformation, or why they can't necessarily get their AI pilots running. And the one thing I always start by asking is, what business problem are you trying to solve? So people at the moment, it's shocking how many CEOs of big companies will say things to me like, I have more pilots than X airline. And you ask them, do you know what the ROI is on any of those pilots? And they say no. You then ask them, did you do robotic process automation? And they get really, really quiet, because chances that I spent 50 million doing that and got no value out of it. So the problem is that much like my 14-year-old has fear of missing out, wants his smartphone, wants to be online, wants to be on Snapchat, CEOs are the same. They really are. They've all got fear of missing out. And I had another CEO tell me about a year ago that he'd gone to Davos, and all the other people in his industry were using ChatGPT to do all these amazing things, and he wasn't, and he was worried that his company would get left behind. And I literally asked him, is there any business problem that you're not addressing? Like, where do you sit in the market? Because I don't know your market. Like, where are you in your rankings and stuff like that? And they were in the top 3, and their revenue keeps growing. So it's like, so what are you actually missing out on? Now, that makes it sound like I think you shouldn't be doing AI, which is not the case. But it comes back to trying to explain to people what the technology is, how it works, and what it does. And I always like to start by pointing out that most of the disciplines of modern AI, whether it's neural networks, expert systems, fuzzy logic, natural language processing, have their roots in math in the 1950s and 60s. So it's been around for a while. If your company has ever had a chatbot, or an IVR, if you don't know what that is, interactive voice recognition unit, the sort of thing where you call into a call center and it asks you, well, who do you want to talk to? What do you want to do? You're using AI. I'm 58. I'm kind of looking around the audience. Do many people remember Mr. Clippit from Microsoft Office? That was a machine learning algorithm in 1997, right? So none of this stuff is actually new. It's really important to understand that. Now, ChatGPT, yes, kind of new. It's only been around about 6, 7 years. Publicly, only 3. But again, it's natural language processing. It's just a different type of natural language processing. Most people do not realize that in 1954, there was an autonomous system doing natural language processing that was successfully translating Russian sentences into English. If you are an AI disciple, if you've done the academics, you can look it up and see it. So again, the reason I kind of preface all this stuff is that when you're talking to the CEO, the most important thing you can do is try to A, demystify it, right? So you need to try to explain the history of some of this stuff, the fact that chances are, regardless of what industry you're in, if you're not an SME, if you're a relatively sort of, let's say, 5,000 person organization or bigger, you probably are using some sort of modeling in finance, in risk, in compliance, which again is based off machine learning or algorithms or something like that. So again, talking to them about the things that you're already using in your company, your CRM system. I mean, if your company is using Salesforce, you're using AI. You don't necessarily know what the AI is doing because Salesforce doesn't want to tell you. That's a different conversation. But again, it's using AI to tell you what clients to focus on, to connect different events. So it's relatively easy to get people comfortable. I know somebody earlier, the guy who did the book, was talking to me about the Netflix example. And again, it's a perfect example to use when you're talking to senior executives who are not technologists. You go onto Amazon, you bought a book. It's recommending other books by the same author or other books in the same genre. Again, it's an algorithm in the back doing the same thing. It's not as insidious as everybody is worried it's going to be. And I think when you start working through the different disciplines and you start talking about how these things work and how they're based on math, it becomes, okay, not everybody's a math nerd. I am. But again, it makes it simple because everybody understands math. At some point in time, we all did algebra, for argument's sake, in secondary school, right? So again, it's something people can connect to and to relate to. I think the other thing that's important is when you try to explain why things go wrong, because they do go wrong, and it's important to make sure that we're open about that you have to explain the complexity underneath it. So one of the things at my last company, I had the CEO, I went in as an advisor. I was actually hired by the company to be an advisor to the executive committee. I was really excited because my previous job, I'd had 1,800 people and I was juggling $2 trillion worth of cash for a really big bank. High stress, very high stress. I had no life. And all of a sudden I had no job responsibilities, no team, no budget. I just listened to what tech and ops were telling the board and explained it to them. So, I mean, literally, it's probably one of the best jobs I've ever had. My job was just to translate between the two teams. And then when the board told me what they wanted, I went back to tech and ops and explained, this is why you're having a problem, and this is how to address it. But analogies were the way to work, right? Or visuals. So when the CEO asked me, why does it take so much to change our middle office algorithmic trading platform, right? So again, they understood the AI bit. We were using it for the last 15 years to do algorithmic trading. What he couldn't understand was why every time he wanted to make a change at the platform, it was costing 2 or 3 million. And so I thought, okay, I need to change the narrative. So I sat down with the group architects and we took the entire database of all the applications and interfaces in the firm, fed it into Neo4j, and produced an architecture diagram that was 2 meters wide and 1 meter high. And I showed up to the board meeting and I literally rolled it out on the table. And the thing is all these people had worked their way through banking. So they knew 20 or 30 systems, but there were 3,500 on this diagram. So as they looked and said, oh, look, I recognize Murex. It was like, okay, but follow the lines. There's 14 upstream systems and 57 downstream systems. So you want to change the model, you have to regression test all 14 upstream systems and all 57 downstream systems. And all of a sudden it fell into place. They got it, they understood the complexity. So then the question became different. Not how do I add a variable to the model, not how do I add a product to the model, it's how the hell do I simplify all these upstream systems? And actually, by doing that, we kind of freed up capacity on the platform, and it became a lot easier to actually update the parameterization of the algorithms so that they could launch new products and go into new markets. Another example was where we had a particular application, I don't want to mention the name, that kept collapsing. It literally, we seemed to be having technical issues, and it would go down, and often at the worst time from a market point of view. Different company, not my last company, just to distance it. And I tried to explain again to the CEO, he said, I just don't understand what the problem is. Because again, it was an ML platform, machine learning platform, sitting on top of an operating system. And I said, okay, you read the newspaper every day, right? And I knew he did. He had like 3 or 4 delivered to his office every morning and went through them all. And I said, how often do you find some sort of typographical error in the newspaper? Like a missing comma, a misspelled word, a homophone, something like that. And he said, like, every day. I said, okay, so now imagine that you had a paper that was 50,000 pages long. That's your operating system. Then we're going to put the ML platform on top of that. That's about another 100,000 pages of newspaper. And then all the data that feeds into that. I said, if you think of it like that, what's the likelihood of there being, let's say, 1,000 typographical errors in that code? And he said, well, probably a lot more. And I said, exactly. So individually, none of these mistakes cause a problem. But you get a situation where at 2:37 p.m. on a Tuesday in a leap year, with too big of a data set or a corrupted file name, everything collapses. And I said, and that's why the tech ops people can't often recreate the problem as well, is because it's the variability of it. So again, simplify. How do we simplify? And in that case, it was a data issue, because that's the other note that I put on here to make sure I tried to mention, was this idea that people think AI can do all the jobs that we pay people to do from a governance point of view. My eldest son works for a tech company. He's a system development engineer, and they're trying to use AI to write code. And we sit there over dinner, and he says, Dad, the code is shite. Like, I spend my whole day fixing the AI's code. And I said, well, again, let's take a look at it. What's the data set that it's using for learning and training? Well, it's the company's code base. So you got to ask yourself, okay, well, what's the problem there? But again, I tried to explain to him, I said, computer programming, and again, I use this analogy with boards all the time, is like literature, right? It's just got a simplified language set. Instead of having 50,000 commonly used words, you've probably got about 1,000. But again, how many people win the Nobel Prize for Literature? 1 a year, that's it. How many people win the Booker Prize? 1 a year, that's it. So how many people are writing books? I mean, like, Jamie's got one. That's like, everybody I know in the data space seems to be publishing a book right now. That's fine, I'm not, I couldn't care less. But again, the point is that if you have this situation where you are training 100 million people a year, more or less, in computer science around the world, how many of those people are the equivalent of a Booker Prize winning author? So when I started back in the 80s, there weren't a lot of computer programmers, and we used to call the people who were really good at it mavens. And it was like, if somebody called you a maven, you knew you arrived, because that meant all the other coders looked up to you, right? And people came to you. Now people talk about distinguished engineers, but literally any Muppet can get a distinguished engineer certificate in his company, if it's company sponsored, if they're there long enough, or they work on an important project. So it's devalued it. And again, when you start talking like this with boards, it's interesting because people start to get it. And I think what you need to do is help them understand, A, how the technology works and how long it's been around for. Because actually, the only thing that's truly unique about ChatGPT or Sora or any of these other things are the LLMs underpinning it. But again, LLMs as a concept is not new, it's just the vast data that's contained within them is orders of magnitude better than what we had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But then ask yourself, how good is the data, right? So I have been a delegate to the Responsible Leaders in AI conference the last couple of years. And the first year we held it, which was 2023, up at Cambridge University at the Intellectual Forum, I asked if I could do something. Like, one of the guys was talking, presenting something. There's only about 50 of us, by the way. It's a real small group of people from all over the world coming together to try to figure out how to influence policy, how to set guide rails, this sort of thing. And I got up and I said, let's ask ChatGPT what it thinks of Silicon Valley Bank. Now, bear in mind, we all got together the week after it collapsed. And of course, it came back and told me what a great investment it was, and all the people who had their money there, and the investors and stuff like that. And the point I was trying to prove, bearing in mind to a room full of AI specialists, was that the output's only as good as the data that goes in. So again, ChatGPT took a data cut. It was already 6 months old. It wasn't giving me a useful answer back out. Did anybody see the news story last week about Deloitte's in Australia? Yeah, right? Perfect example. So for those of you who didn't raise your hand, Deloitte's in Australia got a government contract, I think it was about 500,000 or 600,000 Aussie, to produce a report. They used, I'm not going to say which one, an LLM and a generative AI thing to generate the report, and they gave it to the government. And the government only clocked it because there were 2 academic sources cited in the report, by the way, neither of which were real people. One of whom was supposed to be a professor at the university in Sydney. So they tried to contact the person because, hey, we've got a homegrown knowledge expert. Found out it didn't exist. So Deloitte has now had to refund all the money to the government. Now that's a horribly extreme example, and I'm not trying to bash Deloitte's, right? But these are the sorts of things that people are doing, and these are the sorts of things that are scaring the CEOs and the boards at the moment. I had one guy talk to me about 8 months ago. I was doing a talk for The Economist, and it was like a private event for CEOs, and there were 3 or 4 of us on stage, and he was talking about how his people were uploading information into ChatGPT, and they were using it to summarize their own documents. And I said, okay, have you thought about the consequences of the fact that the way natural language processing and generation works is that every time you get a query back, it's storing all that information. So you're feeding all this stuff into an LLM, it's storing it. You're asking it a question, it's giving you a response, you're telling it it's wrong, it's storing that, and then regenerating. So I said, aside from the fact you're potentially risking your intellectual property, you're actually training it on your business, which means that somebody else from a different business, if they went in and were asking the same questions, would basically get your business model and your business plan back out. And he was horrified to think about it. And one of the people on the panel with me, who was a proper nerd, literally sat down and phrased some queries around this business and asked it to spit out a business plan. And it spat out something that, as the guy read it, he just said that like literally is about 60% of my company's strategy. And so again, it sounds fear-mongering, and it can be. But again, it's about trying to understand how you use the tech. There's a couple of companies now that produce LLMs and generative AI apps that you can put in a container. And so then you can feed it with its own data, right? Which means you could deploy it on your company premises, it could use your data, and actually therefore not create that exposure risk, but also still allow you to experiment. I'm a big fan of experimentation, because I just think, if you don't know what the tool can do, and you don't know when you can use it or if you can use it. It sounds sometimes, and I have had people say this to me, for a technologist and an AI nerd, you really seem anti-AI. And it's like, no, I'm not, any more than I'm anti-blockchain or anti-quantum or any other freaking buzzword technology that seems to be coming along at the moment. What I am is an advocate for saying, explore it, figure out how it works, and then know when you have a business problem, pull it out of the toolbox and see if it fits. And if it fits, by all means use it, and if it doesn't, then don't. And one of the things I wrote on here, because when I was talking to Hannah a couple of weeks ago, is that I don't believe in having a separate AI strategy. So my last employer, very big global bank, got on the bandwagon about 4 or 5 years ago that we had to have a group-wide AI strategy, a group-wide AI ethics policy, and I kind of lost my temper. I was like, worked in the investment bank, I said, literally, I have to go every quarter and explain to regulators around the world how the models work, what we feed them, how they actually generate the pricing data, the risk data, the RWAs, the LRDs, all that sort of stuff. I don't need somebody in group to tell me how I should manage it. I'm quite happy to explain to you guys how we're doing it, but actually we don't have a separate AI policy in the IB. We don't even have a separate tech policy. It's embedded within our business strategy. So there are execution policies, what kind of tech you should use in what kind of contexts, what sort of apps are approved and not, but there's no technology strategy, there's no AI strategy, and indeed there was no data strategy, because I wrote that one as well, and I embedded it back up into the business strategy, because it's how you support execution of the business. And I was over at a different event this morning, which I have to nip back to after this because I'm speaking this afternoon, and I got in this discussion with a data person. And they were asking me, like, how do I justify the team and the expense? Because right now they think AI does everything. And I said, you have to talk to them about garbage in, garbage out. Like, what's feeding the AI? And again, at a different conference last year, I was at a presentation sitting in the front row, and a company got up on stage, started talking about the new chief AI officer, all the sort of stuff they were doing. I thought it sounded interesting. I said, so how does that tie into your data team? And he said, oh, we fired them all. Well, he didn't say fired. He said, we let them all go, as if that's like, let the birds go, they're free. And I said, so who's curating your data? And he said, oh, the algorithm does it. And I said, so what's the data set? Oh, he said, everything. And I was like, oh my God. I said, have you ever looked at your own personal inbox at work? He said, what do you mean? I said, I guarantee you 80% of what's in your inbox is dross. It's your assistant asking you if you want a taxi for something. It's somebody asking you if you want to go for a coffee. It's the whip around for somebody's birthday or birth of their child or marriage or whatever it is, right? There's organizing the Christmas party. Like how much your email, and we're all there, right, is actually useful information. So if you're training it on that, you're training it on junk. The same way ChatGPT is. I mean, literally, 80% of the content on the internet is rubbish. So why would you want to ask it its opinion on something, right? And so again, my point is, when you have the conversation, you have to think about explaining it in a way to your CEO, your CFO, your COO. Ask them, what information do they use to make a business decision? Never say data, because it makes them think Oracle or Exadata or licenses or cloud, and they get uptight because they don't understand it. But you ask what business information they need, and they'll tell you. And then you start saying, okay, but what if the information that you get from so-and-so is wrong? Like, what would that do to your decision process? Well, you know, if this changed, I would probably make this decision because I'd assume it was correct. I said, see, that's how the AI works. So if you feed it the wrong data, or you change the way you decide to make your decision, the AI is going to do the exact same thing. And so again, the importance of understanding how the model works and the data you feed it is really important. Sorry, she's waving the 5-minute sign at me. So I'm going to give you 3 examples from my career, right? I did say I was 58, so I've been around for a while. 1998. I was hired by the BBC in 97. I went in there to help build digital, right? So launching BBC Online, launching digital television, which back then we called On Digital and is now called Freeview. So I was building all the systems that delivered that stuff. One of the problems we had trying to go digital was the fact that 80% of the workforce didn't sit in an office. So I had to figure out a way to connect people to each other. So I went to Autonomy, I went to Microsoft, and I went to Samsung. And I built a knowledge management system that used algorithms to profile staff based on their personnel records. Microsoft embedded little versions of Outlook into a Samsung phone. So remember, this is 98, right? Nobody had smartphones yet. And you could use that to send queries back to find health and safety information. Or your cameraman was sick on location and you wanted to find somebody else who was in the area who wasn't on contract yet. So obviously predictive text, not the best input mechanism, but everybody had a phone. So it was the best way to achieve it at the time. You fast forward 7 or 8 years, I wound up at IBM. I was hired as a sort of brain, kind of the way McKinsey does it. They farmed me out to clients to help them solve problems, because that's what I do. I'm on the spectrum, so I look at all the weird data points and I just figure out things most people don't see. And there was a big bank that had a huge issue with customers. So again, they were using machine learning on their fraud engine for credit card transactions. I'm sure, I mean, anybody here ever had their credit card declined when you knew you had credit available and stuff like that? That's the AI engine in the background, right? Deciding that, fine, you always buy a book at Waterstones and you're at Smith's in a totally different city. Oops, no, I decline it. It literally is that basic sometimes. And I saw you smiling. This client, who was, their corporate was a major client of the bank, and the CEO was a wealth management client of the bank. The guy's wife lived in New York, used to go to the same Whole Foods every week to buy stuff. She happened to be in a different part of New York and went to a different Whole Foods to buy something and got rejected for like a $500 transaction. She was annoyed and upset. She calls her husband. What do you think her husband does? He literally rings the CEO of the bank, and it was a big bank. It's like, this is not okay, da 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 da. And I got drafted in by IBM to go talk to the bank to figure out how to fix it. And I said, why are we focusing on looking for transactions that are anomalous? Why don't we turn the data around? You've got literally hundreds of thousands of data points on this woman. Let's build a profile of how she uses her credit card. So again, in the credit card sort of messaging format, you can see what type of retail operation it is. Is it a hotel? Is it a bookshop? Is it a internet site, you can see location, there's all sorts of variables in there. And I said, why don't we just build profiles? And so that's what we started doing. And every bank has a threshold where they're willing to accept risk. Actually, every company has a threshold where they're willing to accept risk. It's always a trade-off. So they said basically anything under $500, even if it's fraud, doesn't matter, because actually it's gonna cost us more than that to deal with the fallout of somebody calling up and the agent answering the call and trying to clear the lock on the account and stuff like that. So they raised their floor limit, they rolled out the behavioral model. They wound up with their false positives in fraud dropping by 80%, and they didn't, in the first year, ever have a single incident where an actual fraudulent transaction got through. So from their point, really good outcome, right? And one you could quantify with the CFO and the CRO in terms of value to the business, and it wasn't complicated. The last one I'm gonna use is one from UBS, which was my last employer in my last 30 seconds. While I don't write code anymore, except for the odd bit of Python on a Pi portal or a Raspberry Pi when I'm sitting there with my 14-year-old and trying to be cool still, which is a lost cause, I try to figure out how to help people get the same sort of level of understanding in terms of the tooling, right? Hannah's out there passing out stickers that say, I can't wait for AI to take my job, with like a little frog on the beach. I've grabbed a couple because I'm gonna put one on my laptop and my kids' laptops because I think it's fun. But again, I thought that's a real fear people have, right? So I launched a program to create what I called citizen data scientists. So my whole idea was I got my head of data science to build some tooling and to build a data catalog. And then what we did was we rolled that out to normal people in the bank. The people who came to the data science teams to ask questions, you know, where do I get this information from? Can you get me an ETL load from this? Can you extract data from somewhere that I can take a look at, whatever it is? Which, by the way, data scientists don't like doing. So these are people who are real math nerds, statistical nerds. They want to develop insights and inference. The last thing they want to do is pull files for people, right? So when you start asking them what they do and you find out like 60 to 80% of their job is dross, if you can free that up, your staff satisfaction goes up with your data science team, but it also frees them up to actually start doing productive work. And what you do is wind up indirectly upskilling people without telling them you're upskilling them, because everybody wants to know how the tech works. So you give them the tools, you give them the opportunity to play with the tools. Maybe they can't see all the data, right? There's always information barriers in every company for a variety of reasons. But again, they at least know the data's there. They can see the catalog, they can make the query, they can figure out what I could get in terms of insight, and then they could draw it out themselves, and then go to somebody to say, I found this data set, it's got this information, this is the problem I'm trying to solve, but I can't see it. So could you do it for me? Or could you cross me over the information barrier? Time up, right. So I did that in the investment bank. It was hugely successful. I think we started with the assistants. So starting with my own assistant, I literally brought her into a meeting with the team and said, tell them everything I do that pisses you off. And she asked me to leave the room. And then she told them. They were in there for 3 hours. Kind of scared me, actually. But that was how we built the system. Like, we literally just bootstrapped it up over the space of a few weeks, gave her some access to some tooling. She started using it, she started giving it to other assistants, and before you knew it, like, I had a grassroots movement going on. So lots of people will tell you, start at the top and get the buy-in. No. The CEOs already will buy into whatever it is to increase revenue, profitability, decrease operating costs. You don't need that. What you actually need is the people doing the actual work, right? The person I was 30 years ago who's sitting there wondering, you know, is this gonna take my job? So you have to think it's not just about what the CEO needs to know, but it's also about how you get the buy-in down in the ground and get it from the two sides. I hope that was useful.